if you can keep a secret, I use shake and bake now.
What is tomato sauce? Tastes really great.
Lean Dax sliced ham for a lean breakfast.
They were the meals that built America, then vanished without a trace, as if the farm tables they fed were never real at all. What happened to the dinners that once kept whole families strong, and why does their disappearance feel like losing part of who we are? Lard-fried buttermilk rabbit was not just a dinner, it was a decision. A decision made in the middle of the Great Depression, when even chicken started to feel like a luxury meat. Rabbits were easy to trap or raise, and with a hot skillet full of lard, anyone with a little flour and leftover buttermilk could turn tough game into something soft, golden, and indulgent. The gravy was not fancy, just pan drippings and flour whisked together with some water or milk, but it filled every corner of a plate and every empty stomach around the table. Alongside it came cold corn relish made weeks earlier and pulled from the root cellar, its tart snap a perfect contrast to the richness of the rabbit. These days, rabbit has all but disappeared from family kitchens, filed away as something too strange, too wild, too forgotten. But once, it was the main event. And for a generation who grew up hearing the pop of lard in a cast iron pan, that smell still means home. Pickled beet and hard-boiled egg supper plates did not need heat to feel warm. You pulled them straight from the icebox on a Sunday night, when the fire was low and nobody wanted to scrub another pot. The eggs were dyed purple by the beets, steeped together in vinegar and sugar for a day or more until the whites turned magenta and the yolks mellowed out. It was a farmer's version of elegance. These dishes were common after church, laid out with cold biscuits left over from breakfast, a few slices of cheese if you were lucky, and sometimes a spoonful of jam on the side for balance. It was quiet food. Humble, yes, but not boring. The tartness of the beets, the soft salt of the eggs, the crumb of biscuit still holding on. It was all done with intention. And while the beets and eggs were simple, their flavor lingered long after the plates were cleared. We traded meals like this for convenience and forgot what it meant to feel fed without fuss. Salt pork and vinegar slaw sandwiches were never meant to be pretty. They were greasy, sharp, and a little sloppy, just the way a long workday demanded. Salt pork was cheap and powerful, pan-fried into crispy edges that snapped like bark when you bit into them. The vinegar slaw was a raw mix of cabbage, onion, maybe some carrot, and always a healthy pour of white vinegar with just a pinch of sugar to soften the sting. It cut through the fat, woke up your taste buds, and made even dry bread feel alive again. Farmers packed them in wax paper and stuffed them into shirt pockets or saddlebags, where the sandwich would warm slightly by lunch but still taste just right. Salt pork has mostly vanished from store shelves now, and vinegar slaw gave way to creamier versions that missed the point entirely. But once upon a time, this sandwich fed the backbone of rural America. Salty, sour, satisfying to the very last bite. Molasses-baked navy beans with saltine crust were an all-day affair. You did not just throw this dish together. The beans soaked overnight, slow-baked with onion, mustard, and deep, sticky molasses until they were dark and tender enough to break with a spoon. The top was covered in crushed saltines, browned until crisp and flaking like dry pie crust. The aroma alone could carry through every corner of a farmhouse, making you hungrier with every hour it cooked. This was not a side dish, it was the meal. Some threw in a piece of salt pork or a stray sausage if they had it, but it was the molasses that turned these beans into something rich and special. They stuck to your ribs and soothed your mood, even after a day of bad weather or broken tools. Baked beans today come from cans, fast and flat, missing that roasted depth you can only get from patience. But back then, families knew that the beans were worth the wait. And though nobody makes them like this anymore, the memory of those sweet, smoky bites is still somewhere between the walls of every old farmhouse kitchen. Sour cream and onion-fried cabbage cakes were born from boredom. You can only eat boiled cabbage so many ways before you start to rebel, even during rationing. So clever hands found a way to reinvent the leftover greens, chopped finely, mixed with mashed potatoes, onion, and a scoop of sour cream, then pan-fried until crisp and golden. What emerged was somewhere between a latke and a hush puppy, tender in the middle and whispering with steam. These little cakes were served plain with applesauce or next to whatever protein was available, though they could hold their own as a meal. You could smell them cooking from outside the house, especially in winter when anything fried seemed like a gift from the heavens. These days, cabbage has gone back to being either raw in salads or lost in a soup pot. But once, it was the star of the skillet, crisping in bacon grease and proving that even leftovers could become legends. Old-fashioned boiled dinners with ham hocks and turnips were not exciting. They were essential. You put everything in one pot: smoked hocks, peeled turnips, carrots, onions, sometimes a potato or two, and let it all bubble until the bones softened and the broth turned cloudy with fat and salt. This was winter food, designed for nights when the wind rattled the windows and you could see your breath indoors. Turnips were bitter, ham hocks were bony, but together they became something healing. No frills, no garnish, just steam rising from chipped bowls as the family crowded close to eat. You would pick at the bones, slurp the broth, maybe add a slice of hard bread to mop it all up. It was about making a little meat stretch a long way and letting the vegetables do most of the work. But they carried a kind of rhythm, a quiet wisdom passed from hand to hand. They taught us that you do not need much to feel full, just heat, time, and the will to make something from nearly nothing. Milk toast with fried apples and black pepper was a meal for bad days. When money was tight or someone was sick, you made it because it was warm, soft, and kind. Milk toast on its own was simple: toasted bread soaked in hot milk, sometimes sweetened, sometimes salted. Add fried apples, sliced thin, cooked in butter with a bit of cinnamon, and suddenly you had contrast. The apples brought texture and memory, while a little cracked black pepper gave it just enough edge to wake you up. This was food for children, for the elderly, for anyone who needed something gentle but real. It was cheap, fast, and always on hand. Some families added a spoon of sugar, others swore by a pinch of nutmeg, but the core remained the same: warmth over bread. It was meant to take care of you. And for many who grew up with it, that first bite of milk-softened bread and caramelized apples still tastes like love in its quietest form. Scrapple with Garden Chow was not just breakfast, it was survival. Scrapple came from pork scraps and cornmeal, boiled and chilled into a loaf that could be sliced and fried. Every bite was dense, savory, and filled with the flavor of a dozen cuts of meat you could never afford on their own. Paired with Garden Chow, a spicy, vinegary mix of pickled vegetables often canned in the summer and pulled from the shelf when fresh greens ran out, it became a bold, bracing start to any day. This was Pennsylvania Dutch ingenuity, passed down by people who did not waste a single thing. You could eat scrapple with eggs or on bread, hot or cold, but it was the chow that made it feel alive. These days, scrapple is misunderstood or mocked, and chow is nearly impossible to find unless you make it yourself. But once, this combination was as common as buttered toast, and far more memorable. It was the kind of food that told a story just by being on the plate. Chicken feet and dumplings with collard green broth made sure nothing went to waste. Every part of the bird was used, and the feet, once cleaned and simmered, released a gelatin that thickened the soup and made it silky. The dumplings were flour and fat, dropped by spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, soaking up all the flavor like sponges of survival. The broth was built on collard greens, wilted and steeped until they lent their earthiness to every bite. This was not a fancy dinner, it was a necessary one. In black farming communities across the South, this dish was standard, hearty, humble, and rich with culture. It was the kind of food that looked thin in the bowl but sat heavy in the belly. Today, we have forgotten the skill it takes to coax nourishment out of the neglected parts of the pantry. But this meal, every last finger bone and dumpling, was a lesson in gratitude, ingenuity, and care. Cornmeal mush with hot sorghum drizzle was what you ate when you had almost nothing. Just cornmeal, salt, water, and thyme. Cooked low and slow until thick, then poured into a loaf pan to set. The next day, it was sliced and pan-fried in lard or bacon grease, crisp on the edges, soft in the middle. The sorghum, thick, dark, and sweet, was poured hot from a jar and turned something plain into something profound. This was a meal from the South, but it spread across farm states like wildfire during the leanest years. It filled you up and kept you going. It did not need meat, did not need variety, it needed presence. It was not a backup plan. It was the plan. And if you had a jar of sorghum in the cupboard, you were considered lucky. Because with just a few drizzles, even poverty could taste like dessert. Creamed spinach and poached egg over toast points was the kind of dinner you made when teeth were weak, appetites were small, but care was still strong. The spinach was boiled down soft, drained, and folded with cream, butter, and a whisper of nutmeg. Nothing fancy, just deeply nourishing. Then came the egg, gently poached so the yolk stayed golden and runny, a rich counter to the soft green below. Toast points, sliced triangles of day-old bread, crisped in a pan with a little butter or drippings, were there to give the whole dish a bit of structure. This was not a meal to impress a guest. It was a meal made at twilight, after chores were done and the room had quieted. These days it is gone from most tables, written off as too mild, too soft, too old-fashioned. But those who remember it still talk about the calm it brought, how it made you feel looked after in a world that was always moving. It was simple food with deep roots. Cold buttermilk soup with diced cucumbers and dill was a farmhouse secret to beating the heat. When summer came heavy and the cows barely stirred, this bowl of chilled, tangy comfort brought back your appetite and your energy. The buttermilk was sharp and sour, cut with a little cream if you had it, and filled with crisp slices of fresh cucumber straight from the garden. Chopped dill added a clean green bite that lingered on the tongue. Sometimes a hard-boiled egg or a few boiled potato cubes were stirred in for body. You poured it into chipped bowls and ate it with a spoon that clinked against the sides, the coldness rushing through your chest like a breeze across open fields. It was quiet, it was rural, and it was practical. No stove, no baking, just assembly. But somewhere between air conditioning and fast food, this little bowl of cold clarity disappeared. Today it might seem too old world, too odd, but it was the kind of food that felt like a cool cloth across your forehead. Onion pie and a bacon grease crust was never going to win any beauty contests, but it did not have to. It was golden and sagging, its filling pale and fragrant with long-simmered onions, cream, and the faintest dusting of nutmeg or thyme. The crust, made from flour and the drippings saved from countless breakfasts, flaked with a richness that butter could not match. The whole pie was savory, sharp, and grounded in the Midwest, where onions were cheap, plentiful, and dependable. Farmers pulled them from the soil and packed them into cellar baskets, knowing a pie could always be made if everything else ran out. A kind of farmhouse quiche before that word ever made it over from France. As kitchens modernized and bacon grease got swapped for vegetable oil, this dish slipped into the past. But it was a reminder that even the humblest pantry item could become the centerpiece of a meal when treated with time and respect. Onion pie was the taste of resourcefulness baked golden brown. Baked salsify with cheddar crumbs was a dish from a time when vegetables had character, when dirt-covered roots with strange names were regulars at the table. Salsify, also known as oyster plant, grew easily in cooler climates and was dug from the ground with care, its long white taproot looking more like something from a witch's pantry than a grocery shelf. But peeled and boiled, it softened into something creamy and nutty, with a hint of the sea, hence the nickname. It was laid into buttered pans, topped with breadcrumbs and sharp cheddar cheese, then baked until golden and bubbling. This was not a dish for guests. It was quiet food, food that tasted better than it looked. In farmhouse kitchens, it was served as a side or sometimes as the main course when meat was scarce. Supermarkets do not stock it, and few people even know its name. But for those who remember, this dish was a lesson in not judging a food by its first appearance. Beneath the dirt was something worth savoring. Smoked ox tongue with mashed parsnips was a dish that asked for patience, not approval. The tongue, large and leathery before cooking, was scrubbed, brined, and smoked slowly until it sliced like deli meat but tasted deeper, richer, like beef turned inside out. The parsnips, pale cousins to the carrot, were boiled and mashed with butter and a pinch of salt, offering their own subtle sweetness to counter the savory meat. On a cold night, this meal filled the room with steam and the air with the scent of something hearty. It was not glamorous, but it was proud, a dish that used what was available and turned it into something memorable. You did not serve ox tongue to impress. You served it because it was yours to work with. On the farm, nothing went to waste. Every part of the animal had a purpose, and this part, once smoked and sliced, could last through several meals. Tongue has vanished from most plates, and parsnips are more often passed over than picked. But for those who knew how to cook with care, this was a dish that fed more than just hunger. It fed resilience, and it fed family. Hot bacon dressing wilted lettuce salad with boiled potatoes was not just a salad, it was supper. Farm families who came in from the field wanted something fast, filling, and full of flavor. A head of fresh lettuce, torn by hand, was tossed in a bowl with slices of hot, boiled potatoes. Then came the real magic. A skillet of hot bacon grease, vinegar, and sugar poured over everything while still sizzling. The lettuce wilted instantly, turning glossy and tender, while the potatoes soaked up every drop of sweet, sour fat. Sometimes chopped onions or crumbled bacon were added, but it did not need anything else. This was a full meal in one bowl, the kind of recipe that carried you straight through to morning. It was especially common in Pennsylvania Dutch and German immigrant communities, where warm salads were seen as a practical, hearty option. You could make it in minutes, and every part of it came from the land or the smokehouse. These days, salads are cold, crisp, and underdressed. But this one, hot, sharp, and rich, was built for hunger and built to last. It reminded you that dinner did not need meat to feel complete, just a skillet, a spoon, and the right kind of heat. Chipped beef in cream over fried grit cakes was a Southern solution to a national problem. During World War II, meat was rationed, and frugality ruled every kitchen. Chipped beef, dried, salty slivers of preserved beef, was a staple in both military rations and rural homes. Rehydrated in a skillet with cream, butter, and a little black pepper, it became a thick, rich gravy that could dress up anything. Instead of toast, farmers in the South used fried grit cakes, leftover grits chilled in a pan, sliced into squares, and crisped in bacon fat until golden. The result was crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and perfect for soaking up that creamy meat sauce. This dish was known by many names, some polite, some not. But it was beloved all the same. It made something out of nothing. A handful of meat, a little milk, and yesterday's grits became a breakfast or supper that stuck to your bones. Chipped beef may be harder to find now, and grit cakes have been replaced by packaged everything. But this was food that made the most of what you had, and never apologized for it. Fried green tomato and onion sandwiches with mustard butter were what you made when the tomatoes refused to ripen. Green, firm, and tart, they were sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal and fried until golden. The onions, sweet and sharp, were grilled or pan-seared until soft, then layered on top. But the secret weapon was the mustard butter, a mix of softened butter, spicy mustard, and sometimes a pinch of sugar spread thick on toasted bread. This sandwich was loud, crispy, tangy, creamy, and bold. It was also a meal of defiance, a way to eat what was ready rather than wait for perfection. In farm kitchens, that kind of thinking was survival. You worked with what was in your hands. Green tomatoes have mostly become a novelty now, but back then, they were dinner. And this sandwich, messy, crunchy, unforgettable, was proof that sour could still satisfy. Egg noodle and sauerkraut bake with caraway and leftover roast was about making meat go the distance. You took the last slices of Sunday roast, beef, pork, or whatever you had, and chopped them fine. Mixed into a casserole dish with buttery egg noodles, tangy sauerkraut, a little sour cream, and a pinch of caraway seed, it baked into something warm, filling, and deeply familiar. The top crisped, the noodles browned, and the whole dish smelled like a crossroads between old world and new farm. It was a dish born from thrift, but also from memory. German and Eastern European immigrants brought the flavors of sauerkraut and caraway with them, and those tastes settled into the soil of American farmland. This bake became a regular in the Midwest and Appalachia, places where nothing got thrown out, and second-day meals were often the best of the week. Today, we throw out leftovers without a thought, but once they were the start of something even better. This dish proved that with the right touch, yesterday's scraps could taste like a holiday. Baked stuffed marrow squash with sage and crumbled sausage was a celebration of the garden's last gifts. Marrow squash, large and mild, was hollowed out and roasted until tender, then filled with a savory mix of breadcrumbs, sausage, onions, and sage. Sometimes the stuffing included chopped apples or dried cranberries, especially in autumn. The whole thing was baked again until bubbling, the top crisped and golden, the inside soft and fragrant. It was hearty, filling, and served in thick slices like a meatloaf wrapped in a vegetable. On farms, it was a way to use up the oversized squash that nobody knew what to do with. But in truth, it was better than many of the meats it was meant to replace. These days, you might find a squash or two at the market, but the recipe has slipped through the cracks. Too rustic, too messy, too tied to a way of living most people no longer recognize. But on the farm, this was feast food, a gift from the earth, wrapped in soil, seasoned by hand. Roasted chicken necks and backs with barley and leeks was a recipe that turned scraps into treasure. The necks and backs, too small for most, held pockets of rich meat and skin that melted into the pot with time. Roasted low and slow, they gave up every bit of flavor, transforming water into broth and barley into something more than just grain. The leeks were sliced thin and cooked until sweet, their gentle bite curling around every spoonful. This dish was not about presentation. It was about intention. You started it in the morning and served it at dusk, knowing the pot had done the work for you. It made something out of what others threw away, and in farm kitchens, that was as close to magic as you could get. Today, these parts are discarded or sold for pennies, but back then, they were dinner. They were comfort in a world that offered little else. And when the barley soaked up every last drop of golden broth, it felt like you had won something. Cold ham loaf with spiced apple rings and gelatin salad was Sunday lunch without the oven. The ham loaf, pink, pressed and slightly sweet, was sliced thin and served cold, like a meatloaf that never saw heat. Alongside it came apple rings, spiced with cinnamon and clove, stewed until they were tender and fragrant like pie filling. The gelatin salad sat trembling in its mold, packed with shreds of carrot or bits of celery, sweet and strange and somehow expected. This was a plate you saw on pastel-colored plastic trays, or at church gatherings with mismatched forks. White bread on the side, maybe a thick smear of yellow mustard, and a pickle spear for punctuation. It was cooling food for hot kitchens, a way to serve something that felt full without ever lighting the stove. Ham loaf has all but vanished, and gelatin salads are more joke than joy these days. But for those who grew up with them, this was the taste of a summer table. Cold plates, quiet fans, and nowhere to be but home. Potato and onionpone with buttered collards was a skillet meal with soul. Cornmeal formed the base, mixed with mashed potatoes, shredded onion, salt, and a bit of bacon grease. Then packed into a cast-iron pan and baked until the edges were crisp and the middle was dense and steamy. The top crackled as it cooled, and the scent was somewhere between cornbread and roasted hash. Next to it came the collards, cooked low and slow with a pat of butter, maybe a chunk of ham bone if you had one. The greens were dark and silky, the broth salty and rich, spooned over the pone like gravy. It was not a fancy dinner, but it was deeply satisfying, hot, thick, and filling. You could feed a field worker on one plate and know they would make it through until dawn. Potato and onionpone has faded away, replaced by boxed mixes and frozen sides. But once, it was the crown jewel of cast iron, crusted at the bottom and steaming at the top. A reminder that even the simplest ingredients could shine with heat and time. Gooseberry glazed pork chops with fried breaded okra was a dish that danced on the line between sweet and sharp. The gooseberries, sour and green when fresh, were cooked down with sugar into a tangy glaze that clung to the seared pork like a second skin. The meat, often from a thin chop or shoulder cut, was browned hard in a cast iron skillet before being finished in the glaze, soaking up that lip-puckering sweetness. Beside it came okra, sliced, dredged in cornmeal and fried until golden. The outer crust crunched while the inside stayed soft and sticky, a texture only Southerners knew how to love. Gooseberries grew wild near fences and barn edges, and once they ripened, they went into everything from pies to pork. These days, you will rarely see them outside of specialty markets, and most folks would not know what to do with them anyway. But this dish was a reminder that flavor used to be chased, not just bought. And when it landed on your plate, it tasted like a southern summer in full bloom. Rabbit liver and onions with sorghum-baked cornbread was not just brave, it was respectful. On the farm, nothing went to waste, especially not the liver, which was tender, iron-rich, and deeply flavored. It was soaked in milk to soften its bite, then seared with onions until it browned at the edges and melted in the middle. Next to it came the sorghum cornbread, a slightly sweet, dense bread made with stone-ground cornmeal and thick black syrup, baked until the crust browned and cracked. Kids often hated it, but as you grew older, so did your taste for it. Rabbit liver was harder to clean, smaller than other kinds, but somehow more delicate too. Today, it is almost impossible to find, and even those who hunt rarely keep it. But back then, this dish was a mark of respect, to the animal, to the meal, to the cook. It was about making something honest and filling from what others would throw away, and in that quiet pride, it became a favorite. Tomato gravy over skillet cornbread with country ham bits was a breakfast that felt like supper. The gravy started with bacon grease or lard, flour browned in the fat, then stirred with chopped tomatoes, fresh or canned, until it thickened into something smooth, tangy, and red. A pinch of sugar brought balance, a dash of pepper gave heat. Poured hot over a wedge of skillet-baked cornbread, it soaked in fast, turning crumb into gold. The ham came next, fried bits or scraps from the bone, scattered on top like a garnish. This was a meal that lingered, that filled every crevice and corner of your morning. It was common across the South, especially in Appalachian kitchens where tomatoes were always in the pantry and cornbread never far behind. Today, gravy means sausage or cream, and tomato versions have faded into memory. But this dish was a celebration of the harvest, the hog, and the hearth. It was simple, yes, but also deeply satisfying. A reminder that the best meals are not always planned. They are what happens when a clever cook meets a well-seasoned skillet. Turnip green stew with corn dumplings and fatback was a bowl that smelled like winter survival. The greens were chopped rough and simmered with fatback, thick, salty cuts of pork belly that melted slowly into the broth. The stew was thin but rich, flavored with onion, garlic, and vinegar, then dotted with dumplings made from cornmeal and a touch of lard. The dumplings steamed as they cooked, puffing up into soft, yellow clouds that floated above the greens. You did not need meat to make this stew satisfying. The fatback did the talking. It was ladled into bowls wide enough to hold your hands over, eaten with cornbread on the side or just a spoon if that was all you had. Today, turnip greens are just another option in a plastic bag, and fatback is a curiosity. But once, this stew kept people warm when coal was low and spirits lower. It was simple, briny, and honest. Food that told the truth. A truth about hard times, good land, and the genius of stretching flavor from the humblest ingredients. Scalloped potatoes with chopped pickles and farm cheese were creamy, tangy, and unlike anything boxed. Sliced thin by hand, the potatoes were layered in a pan with cheese curds or soft farmhouse cheddar, then scattered with chopped dill pickles and slathered in a thick, peppery white sauce. Baked until bubbling and browned on top, the edges crisped while the center stayed molten. The pickles gave it a jolt of acid, the cheese gave it stretch, and the potatoes carried it all. This was not a side dish. It was a full meal when times were lean. Served in enamel pans or deep cast-iron skillets, it came out of the oven ready to feed a crowd. Pickles were homemade, packed in crocks with garlic and dill, and the cheese was often from your own churn or the neighbor's. Today, scalloped potatoes are bland, pre-sliced, and packed in powder. But once, this dish was the pride of the pantry. A creamy, salty, briny hug from the heartland. The kind of food that fills you, not just your stomach. Fried hominy with sausage drippings and buttermilk was crunchy, golden, and criminally forgotten. Hominy, dried corn treated with lime, was rehydrated, drained, and fried in a skillet slick with leftover sausage fat. Each kernel popped and crisped, turning golden and savory with edges that sizzled. A splash of buttermilk on the side or over the top brought tang and cut the richness. This was a breakfast that needed no eggs, no bread, just a spoon and a quiet moment. Hominy was common on farms, cheap and shelf-stable, often bought dry in sacks and stored for winter. Today, you will barely find hominy unless you know where to look, and few remember how to fry it right. But for those who grew up hearing it pop in the skillet, the memory is clear. It was hearty, humble, and hot. A farm's version of fast food, built on leftovers and instinct. Canned salmon potato bake with crushed saltine topping was the war-era miracle that fed 6 on a dime. The salmon, pink, briny, and packed with bones, was mixed with mashed potatoes, chopped onions, an egg or two, and some parsley if you had it. Packed into a buttered dish and topped with crushed saltines, it baked into something greater than the sum of its parts. The edges crisped, the top browned, and the center stayed soft and steaming. This was not elegant, it was efficient. Canned salmon was often sent in government relief boxes, and this bake turned it into something warm and homey. Today, salmon is a premium fillet, not something baked with potatoes in a chipped casserole dish. But this recipe was a triumph of invention, a proof that with a little heat and a lot of heart, even the barest pantry could serve up something unforgettable. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Fermented foods were a soldier's unsung hero in the field because of their long shelf life, health benefits, and easy storage. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented grains were common staples, valued for their ability to withstand harsh conditions without spoiling. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's a pretty big deal. The process of fermentation, which involves converting sugars into alcohol or acids, offered a natural boost to the immune system. Fermented foods like sauerkraut are rich in probiotics, which help with digestion and overall gut health. Soldiers, especially during long campaigns, appreciated the natural preservation methods. Without refrigeration, these foods could survive months in storage, often more reliable than any other food they had on hand. While fermented foods may not have been the most exciting part of a soldier's diet, they served a crucial purpose. They were easy to transport, didn't require constant attention, and provided essential nutrients. After a long day in the field, a bite of tangy sauerkraut might have been a welcome change from the usual dried meats or hardtac. Fermented foods were a lifeline in keeping soldiers healthy, and often they gave a taste of home when nothing else could. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s, though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. For sailors at sea, ship's biscuit was the original survival food. Tough, durable, and ready for whatever the ocean could throw at it. Made from flour, water, and sometimes salt, this dense, rock-like bread was a necessity during long voyages. The biscuits were designed to last for months without spoiling, but in the humid, salty conditions aboard ships, they often came with an unwelcome bonus: weevils. Yes, those little critters that make every meal feel like a crunch on a whole new level. Despite its toughness and the occasional extra protein from those weevils, ship's biscuit was a staple for maritime forces. While sailors would dunk them in water or soup to soften them, it didn't make them any more appetizing. In fact, if you've ever wondered why sailors were often depicted with a scowl, maybe it wasn't just the rough seas. Maybe it was the food. The biscuit's longevity was its biggest asset. In a world where fresh food was a luxury, ship's biscuit could endure for months in storage. But let's face it, if your lunch comes with a side of bugs, you might start dreaming of anything but biscuits. Still, it was a part of naval life. Tough, resilient, and certainly something you'd hope to eat only out of necessity. Dried peas may be the wallflowers of the legume world, but they were the unsung heroes of many kitchens during the Great Depression. These little green powerhouses were tiny, nutrient-packed, and incredibly cheap, just the kind of food that families could stretch their food budgets as far as possible. In particular, split peas shone brightly as the star ingredient in hearty soups and stews. A handful of vegetables, maybe a scrap of salt pork, simmered with a pot of water made a meal that could warm bellies and spirits. The peas themselves were a solid dose of protein for those who couldn't afford meat and helped families stay nourished when times were tough. A near-infinite shelf life also came from dried peas. They could be stored in jars or cloth sacks and could last for years, making them a reliable choice for households that wanted to prepare for lean months. Peas were often grown by rural families, which dried and preserved them for the winter, or city dwellers went to market stalls to get their supply. Dried peas have been overshadowed by the flashier ingredient, but their legacy remains. They remind us that sometimes the simplest foods are the most dependable, feeding families through economic storms with a few handfuls of green perseverance. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either. at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Gooey Buttercake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for two reasons. Gooey Buttercake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis Gooey Buttercake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Imagine biting into something so hard that it could double as a building material. That was hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. It wasn't exactly a culinary delight, but it was a lifesaver for soldiers and sailors on long campaigns. Its secret was longevity. Properly stored, hardtack could last for years and, in some cases, even decades. But eating it wasn't for the faint of heart or teeth. Soldiers often joked it was hard enough to stop a bullet. To make it edible, many soaked it in water, coffee, or stew to soften it. Without that, breaking it might feel like a test of willpower. Salted and cured to withstand long journeys, dried fish added essential nutrients, though the smell wasn't exactly subtle. Imagine a ship full of men and barrels of dried fish during a humid summer. Let's just say it's a good thing Fabrese wasn't invented yet. These simple foods fueled explorers, sailors, and armies through grueling months without fresh supplies. Though unassuming, they were engineering marvels of preservation and utility, proof that survival often came at the cost of flavor. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even Dandelion Salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out, and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Back to the Appalachian region, and this time the Piedmont region as well, a sonker is one of the highlights of Northern Carolina cuisine. It's often served warm with like a generous scoop of ice cream, but it's actually a fruit dessert. These are really popular up in the South, you know? They get very serious about their fruit desserts. It's hard to find out where the dish first originated from, but lots of people believe that farming families that were trying to make the best out of their fruits are the first ones who found it. Actually, a lot of people seem to unanimously agree that it first popped up in Surry County. This is also where it's most well known, so maybe this one has a bit of truth to it. The city of Mount Airy in Surry County is also known for its massive use of sonkers and how it really doesn't ever let up on them. People there make these throughout the year, around the clock, and it's a point of competition for local bakeries too. Surry County even has Sonker Day, which is an annual event that celebrates the dessert. It's this community thing in Pilot Mountain, and people from around the place come and make their best version of a sonker, along with lots of other regional foods that have tons of history. The sonker contest is one of the best things to check out in the area, so if you're ever around, give it a visit. Fatback is an odd little thing. If you look at it in retrospect, it's pretty much exactly what the American people needed back when the effects of the stock market crash were still really fresh. If you look at it from a medical point of view, It was one of the worst things that Americans became obsessed with. If you take a bird's eye view of things, then the truth is actually a little bit in the middle, as it is with most things. Yes, it is true that fatback, which is basically the fat off a pig's back, genius naming scheme by the way, was really helpful throughout the first half of the 20th century. It helped to preserve food. A little bit of it would enhance the flavors of a dish to levels that people didn't think were possible. And it's also true that it was invaluable during food shortages and really rough rationing phases. Still, the opposite is a stone-cold fact too. Fatback is an awful, awful thing to have regularly for your health and cholesterol. There's a Boondocks episode called The Eaties, where people pretty much start passing out and get hospitalized because they just can't put the pork down, and I'm afraid that's not really too far off from the truth. That's also why around the 1980s this dish pretty much disappeared from the public eye entirely. Health concerns had been growing rapidly around the 1980s thanks to the stuff people had been eating pretty much throughout the entire century. It really peaked when fast food chains became an everyday fact of life, not just something you had on weekends. In the midst of all that, people eventually cut their ties with their fatback-laced stews, soups, and casseroles. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Preserving food was a matter of survival, and for soldiers on the move, smoked meat was more than a meal. It was a lifeline. Long before refrigeration, smoke was nature's preservative, infusing meat with flavor while keeping bacteria at bay. Unlike salted meat, which could be tough and overwhelmingly briny, smoked venison, beef, or even pork offered a more palatable and aromatic option. The process wasn't quick. Smoking meat required hours, sometimes days, over low, consistent heat, with wood types carefully chosen for their flavor. Hickory, oak, and applewood were integral to the preservation process. Once smoked, the meat could last for weeks or even months, making it ideal for soldiers who had to carry their food supply on their backs. This preservation method wasn't without its quirks. Smokehouses where the magic happened became a common sight near military camps. They were so important that losing one to fire or sabotage could cripple an army's food reserves. Of course, the soldiers weren't exactly gourmands. A joke went that smoked meat was great for keeping your teeth in shape, if you could chew through it. But on a cold night, after a long march, a strip of smoked beef paired with bread or pottage was as close to comfort food as a soldier could get. For soldiers on the march, portability was everything, and few foods were as reliable as bread and cheese. Roman legionnaires famously carried flat loaves of bread and wedges of hard cheese, often made from sheep or goat's milk. The combination was a nutritional powerhouse, carbs for energy and protein for strength, all in a package that could survive the harsh conditions of a campaign. But let's not romanticize it. The bread was often dense and tough, more akin to a brick than a baguette. Soldiers sometimes had to soak it in water or wine just to make it chewable. The cheese wasn't the creamy delight you'd find at a deli. Aged for durability, it leaned more toward rock hard than velvety soft. Still, when paired together, they made a meal that was surprisingly satisfying and, most importantly, long-lasting. In medieval times, knights and foot soldiers kept the tradition alive, carrying wheels of cheese and hearty loaves during long marches. Back then, breaking bread wasn't just a saying, it was a literal act of survival. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but when the choice is between stale bread and hunger, even a Roman would tell you, the bread wins every time. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Among the meals that fueled armies across Northern Europe, few were as humble and essential as porridge. Whether made from oats, barley, or a mix of both, this hearty dish was a staple in the Scottish Highlands and across many Northern European forces. Easy to prepare, filling, and rich in nutrients, porridge was a soldier's reliable companion, especially in colder climates where extra calories were crucial for maintaining energy. Soldiers were often given a basic porridge made from oats and barley, both of which were cheap and durable. The simplicity of the dish didn't stop there. Flavoring was minimal, often just a sprinkle of salt. However, on rare occasions, dried fruits like raisins or berries might be thrown in for a touch of sweetness, a welcome surprise in an otherwise bland meal. But the real beauty of porridge was its versatility. Whether served thick and dense or thinner, it could be adapted to whatever was available. The grains were easy to store and transport, and the dish could be cooked over a fire without requiring much effort. When times were tough, oats and barley provided soldiers with the carbohydrates and fiber they needed to power through long, exhausting days on the march. In the chaos of ancient and medieval warfare, time was a luxury, and so was leavened bread. When soldiers needed sustenance on the go, they turned to flatbread, a simple yet effective solution. Made from flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, it required no rising time and could be baked on a flat stone or a metal plate over an open fire. Flatbread was a culinary bridge between cultures. From the Roman legions to medieval Arab armies, its versatility made it a universal staple. Soldiers could eat it plain, use it to scoop up stew, or even wrap it around dried meat for an early version of the sandwich. And unlike leavened bread, flatbread was far more forgiving. It could survive days of travel without becoming a crumbly mess. It wasn't all perfection, though. Cooking over a fire meant the bread could be scorched in seconds if you weren't careful. More than a few soldiers probably had to settle for extra crispy flatbread when they got distracted by a battle horn. Still, this simple, adaptable bread earned its reputation as a battlefield favorite. If one of these forgotten dinners stirred a memory, or made you wish it did, share your story in the comments, give this video a like, and hit subscribe so these lost flavors never vanish again.